Greetings and welcome to the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. My name is Peter Mandeville, and I'm a senior research fellow here at the center. Here at Georgetown, I lead the Berkley Center's Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power project, a multi-year research initiative enabled by generous support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, dedicated to exploring and understanding the various ways that religion fits into the foreign policy and external relations of states and governments around the world. Today's program is part of this project, and we're very grateful to you for joining us. We are delighted to welcome to the Berkley Center today Dr. Timothy A. Burns, Professor of Political Science at Colgate University. Dr. Burns's presentation today will explore the papacy, past and present, religious soft power, and international diplomacy. The Pope is, of course, not only the religious leader of the largest Christian denomination in the world, but also, in his capacity as head of the Holy See, the leader of a recognized sovereign entity in international law. Throughout history, popes have functioned as diplomatic actors, sometimes in partnership with, but often at odds with other sovereign leaders. This is, of course, a particularly timely moment to be exploring the diplomatic role of the papacy, given that Pope Francis has just recently returned from a very high-profile visit to Iraq, a setting that has obviously figured very directly in some of the most challenging issues in international politics and security in recent years. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read Dr. Burns's biography in full, but rather will paste in the chat box a link that you can click on in order to read his very impressive online profile. I've also included a link to the main landing page for the Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power project, where you can learn more about the initiative and also access the wide range of articles, working papers, and video recordings of previous talks associated with the project. We're very excited that in 2021, the project will be publishing not one, but two edited volumes with Oxford University Press, one of which will feature a chapter contributed by today's speaker. Before I hand things over to Dr. Burns, just a few brief words about logistics and our format today. I wanted to make sure that you are all aware that today's session is being recorded, particularly for the benefit of those who are not able to join us for the live session. And those of you who have registered and are with us will all receive a link to the video when it becomes available. We're going to begin the session by hearing a presentation from Dr. Burns, and about halfway through the time we have together, we'll pivot into a more interactive portion of the program where you in the audience will have the opportunity to ask questions of our speaker. And in order to do that, we'll be using the Q&A function, which is available in the main Zoom control bar. If you click that, you'll see a box that opens and you can type your questions into that box. And you can do that at any point during the session. When we then move over to the interactive portion of the program, I'll be moderating that discussion. And so we'll be able to put your questions to Dr. Burns then. So without further ado, I want to offer a very warm welcome to Tim Burns. Thank him for joining us today and hand things over to you.
All right, well, thank you, Peter, for having me. It's great to be here. Here is in my basement, but in these times, this is a nice, easy way to come to Georgetown and talk about my work. As Peter mentions, there was this event in the last couple of weeks which really sort of highlighted the role of Pope Francis and the papacy in international affairs, his trip to Iraq. And when I was thinking about what I would say today, I thought, well, I'll lay out the whole sort of argument I want to make about soft power in the Catholic Church, and then I'll kind of apply it to the trip to Iraq. But I think I'm actually going to do the opposite. And that is sort of start with the trip to Iraq, describe it in the terms that I want to use concerning power, and then sort of, after quickly doing that, double back and clarify the categories that I'm talking about. But first, of course, just sort of defining soft power in the most general sense. Most people familiar with international relations know that by and large, international relations as a field, as an academic field, not necessarily as a sort of behavior on the earth, has been devoted mostly to what's called hard power. Resources that a state will have that it can use to try to advance its interest. That can be the size of its population, that can be its military resources, that can be its economic resources and power. and that these resources are used by states in the international arena to sort of advance the interests of a state, to pressure other states to do what the powerful state wishes them to do. And there was a shift a couple of decades ago now, I guess, where people started to think about, excuse me, power in international affairs as more broadly based and not necessarily only on hard power, military, economic, and population size resources. And the project that Peter is heading here and that he said will be coming out in edited volume was trying to look at sort of various articulations of religious soft power. And what's kind of sort of shocking is that Joe Nye, a well-known scholar of international affairs, he wrote his book on soft power, and on page two, before he even defines what soft power is, he cites the papacy as an institution that can influence people without having hard power resources. He quotes the famous quote from Joseph Stalin when he said, "How many divisions has the Pope?" And Nye's assumption here is that popes no longer have divisions. Of course, they did in European history, but the fact that popes no longer have divisions doesn't mean that the popes no longer have political influence. And he talks about moral authority, moral megaphones even, and what he calls the power of attraction, that states, he's basically talking about states, can assert a kind of a soft power through various cultural, social, other ways of influencing other states. You know, an example is Hollywood is an enormous source of soft power for the US, as Bollywood is for India. But so to get back to the Pope, so it's interesting that Nye, who's sort of the main generator of this way of thinking about power, he talks about the Pope right away. And here I just want to sort of describe the trip to Iraq as a kind of a perfect storm of articulation or an attempt to articulate soft power. Whether the power is actually influential, whether the power is actually, the Pope is actually an agent, is something I hope we can talk about. But the Pope goes to Iraq, and the first thing to say about this trip is that it is surrounded by a kind of a media attention, hullabaloo, frenzy, any word you want to use, that I think is sort of unprecedented for any other religious leader in the world. The coverage of the Pope's trip to Iraq was front page news all over the world, both before he went, while he was there, and immediately after he left. I would go so far as to say that there is no other non-governmental actor in the world that would attract this kind of media and public attention. But of course, in calling the Pope a non-governmental actor, I'm using a kind of a problematic term, because the Pope, as the head of the Holy See, not Vatican City, but I don't think we want to go down that rabbit hole. The Pope, as the authoritative head of the Holy See, is a juridical actor in international relations. So it's not quite right to call him a non-governmental actor or a non-state actor, even though he doesn't represent a state, right? The Vatican City is not the juridical actor, the Holy See is. But the Holy See, with the Pope as its authoritative leader, has formal diplomatic relations with 183 countries. I checked the other day, 183 countries, including Iraq. So the Pope goes to Iraq not only as a kind of a religious leader and pilgrim, he goes to Iraq on a state visit. He's greeted at the airport by the president of Iraq by diplomatic protocol. The first meeting he has is in private with the president of Iraq. So the Pope is already this very unusual actor. We'll get back to this later, in that he travels the world, he interacts with states, he confers with world leaders as a person, a leader of this hierarchical institution that has formal diplomatic relations with these states. So in a kind of an odd way, Pope Francis went to Iraq on an official state visit as the authoritative leader of the Catholic Church. So that gives him a kind of an official status that literally no one else in the world has. And so what do popes want to do with this status? Well, one of the things that popes want to do is they want to try to assert what I would call direct soft power. They want to use their status, both as a juridical actor in international affairs, a permanent observer at the United Nations, and as this kind of enormously focused on global celebrity, right? He is, the Pope, the papacy, is a site of enormous global celebrity. So the Pope wants to use this global celebrity, all modern popes do, for a number of purposes. One is, and perhaps most fundamentally, to protect the institutional interests of the church itself. So the Pope sort of represents the church, as it were, in international politics. And when he went to Iraq, one of the central goals of his trip was to offer solidarity and a certain kind of defense to the Christian communities in Iraq, many of which are in full communion with the papacy. He wanted to offer them solidarity and defense. As most people know, they have suffered a very difficult period, particularly since the US invasion of Iraq. Popes want to use their soft power also to advance the sort of moral teachings of the church. That the papacy represents a sort of a Catholic voice in the world, in all kinds of different contexts. And in the trip to Iraq, I think you saw Pope Francis speaking a great deal about peace, tolerance, things that he not only recognizes as elements of Catholic teaching, but also things that he's seeking, I think, to emphasize as elements of Catholic teaching. So he was there as a kind of spokesperson, if you will, for a certain way of, for him, Catholic way of thinking about the challenges that are faced by the people of Iraq. And he speaks constantly in this way about trying to advance what he sees as the Catholic message. For example, talking a lot about the dangers of what he considers religious extremism. So he's making sort of categorical claims about how religious people ought to participate in politics, both national and global. And then popes also want to use this soft power, this kind of celebrity and diplomatic status and sort of enormous attention they receive, to argue in favor of certain ways of structuring political relationships. And these can be quite deep structurally. We'll talk about a few of them later. But in this case, you see Pope Francis going to Iraq to really emphasize a kind of interreligious dialogue, right? The sort of iconic meeting with Al-Sistani, this homily, a speech he gave at the birthplace of Abraham, where the Pope Francis is talking about interreligious dialogue as a value that he holds, as he's trying to associate the Catholic Church and his position with that. He's trying to use any kind of influence that he has, both through the media and through direct interaction with people in Iraq elsewhere, to bring about more comedy between the various religious communities, both Iraq and elsewhere. I think the visit to Abraham's birth is a way of talking about the brotherhood of the Abrahamic faiths, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, although for complicated reasons, some Jewish leaders did not attend that event. So he's trying to, Pope Francis is trying to assert influence by a power of attraction, or what Carr 100 years ago called the power of opinion, right? He's not threatening anyone. He's not coming with an army. He's not really coming with economic resources. He's not coming with a population, because the population of the Vatican City is, in 3 digits probably, but he's coming with this kind of soft power, this moral spokesman for an institution. And of course, he is, in a sense, seeking to represent, in a sense, this is a complicated concept in Catholicism, but he's seeking to represent and speak for a billion people, right? This huge, sprawling Catholic Church that he is saying, this is our view, or at least this is my way of articulating our view when it comes to the plight of Christians in Iraq, when it comes to the role of religion in political conflict, and when it comes to a construct of interreligious dialogue. So this is what I call direct soft power by the Pope. This is an effort by him to use his position as the Supreme Pontiff of the Catholic Church. He wants to use his position to articulate certain interests, certain teachings, certain straightforwardly political goals that he's trying to use his office to advance directly. But it's also very important to note when we're thinking and talking about the papacy, that the papacy also has what I would call an indirect soft power. And that is an effort by the popes, the modern papacy, to seek to influence global affairs, not only directly by what they say and do and by how they participate in diplomatic affairs, but also indirectly by influencing these billion or 1.2 billion Catholics across the world. The Pope has what political scientists would call unprecedented access to actors. And so faithful Catholics, whatever percentage of that billion are faithful Catholics are providing some sort of attention, some sort of obedience to positions that the Pope takes. And he's saying these things directly to try to influence world affairs, but he's also saying these things indirectly. So he's communicating not only to other actors in the international arena, he's also communicating within his church. And he, in the case of the trip to Iraq, he's making these same sort of claims to Catholics about moral teaching for tolerance, peaceful resolution of conflict, interreligious dialogue, tolerance of other religious communities. And so, like I said, this is a kind of an almost paradigmatic example of how a modern pope seeks to use his office of the papacy to influence world events. He's greeted as a juridical actor in international affairs by the president of Iraq. He's seeking to advance the interests of Catholics who live in Iraq and other Christians. He's seeking to advance Catholic teaching through the megaphone that the media has handed him. He's seeking to articulate a very broad conception of how religious communities should interact with each other in the context of political conflict. And at the same time he's doing that, he's in a sense sermonizing to a billion people in the hopes that those billion people will adopt, accept, advance some of these interests and emphases, and then they will then advance those same interests, teachings, and emphases, if you will, in their lay apostolate throughout the world. This is a modern conception of the papacy. It's not brand new, but it's a relatively modern conception of the papacy in the sense that the papacy today is able to express these forms of soft power in ways that were really not available to popes in sort of, let's say, pre-mid-20th century Catholic Church. Now, historians much more schooled in the scope of Catholic history than I have all kinds of arguments about the degree to which the papacy was authoritative in other eras, the degree to which the papacy was engaged in leading the church in certain ways. And certainly the papacy was a central player in European power politics for a very, very, very long time before the loss of the Papal States in the 19th century. So there were various elements of this which were quite important within the life of the church. But if we could just choose one time to say how this sort of modern effort began, I would focus on Pope John the 23rd and his use of global media. Now, he had an advantage in a way in that he was following the sort of stern outlook of his predecessor, Pius XII. But John the 23rd realized when he ascended the throne of St. Peter that if he smiled, the global media would pay a lot of attention to it. And so he smiled. But he also did a lot of other things which are related to these ways of thinking about soft power. He called the Second Vatican Council, of course, and these are not actions directly by the Pope. But if you look at the documents of the Second Vatican Council about religious liberty, about relations with Jews, about relationship with the world outside the church, these brought about enormous shifts in how the papacy was going to articulate and express what I'm calling soft power. He issued two very important encyclicals about the church and about its role in the world. These were especially Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth. These were directed not just to Catholicism, but this was a statement by the papacy in the early 1960s in the sort of heat of nuclear concerns and nuclear competition about what the Catholic Church through the papacy had to say about this. And he was speaking in a way to world leaders as well as he was speaking to individual Catholics. Of course, where this really got off the ground in its most clear form was with the election of Karol Wojtyła to the papacy in 1978. And Wojtyła became used not only to global media in the way that John the 23rd had, but used global travel. If someone asks me, like, what's the most important thing about the modern papacy? I think I would say planes, right? The idea that John Paul II was going to travel. And again, if you look at John the 23rd in these categories that I'm talking about, his diplomatic role was extremely important in how he dealt with the United States and the Reagan administration towards East Central Europe. His defense of the church in Poland and elsewhere by going there and representing a different way of thinking about political structures in East Central Europe and elsewhere. His almost unhuman energy that he expressed throughout his papacy to try to convince all of these Catholics that they should agree with him on pretty much everything, right? He's a problematic ecclesiastical figure in that sense, in that he brought so much attention in the papacy, so much effort to assert this soft power that perhaps other local articulations of the church were not as did not grow and develop as they might have. But he did both of these things that I'm talking about so energetically, was that he sought to use his own person as Pope to directly influence world affairs, whether that was in East Central Europe, whether that was in Latin America, wherever it might happen to be, and that he would use the attention of the media, he would use his diplomatic status to make these direct articulations of influence. But he was also completely engaged in the practice of seeking really to assert power over the Catholic Church, so that the Catholic Church, in this I mean in the Vatican II sense, the people of God, would then assert his preferences. Just quickly, I think Pope Francis is a very modern pope in certain ways. He has eschewed the trappings of the regal aspects of the papacy, but he is savvy in his use of the military. He is savvy in his use of Twitter. Pontifex tweets at least once a day about various ways the Pope wants to express himself. And I think he has used all of his levers of authority in a kind of a pontificate defining effort to associate himself and his church with the interests of the poor and the marginalized. And you see this across every way of articulating power. He uses diplomatic power to, for example, grant asylum to migrants who come into Europe. He uses his diplomatic power to broker diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba. He is constantly speaking about the marginalized and the poor. The issues that he focuses on, climate change, refugees and migrants, etc. And he has a very specific way of talking about these, like Laudato Si, his encyclical on climate change, is not just that we have to steward God's creation, although it is that, it's also that we have to steward God's creation in the advancement, defense, and protection of the least powerful, who are the most subject to the devastation of climate change. So Pope Francis, as I talked about in Iraq, he has used this model of travel and communications. He's tried to use his diplomatic power. He tries to advance the teachings of the church as he articulates them. He seeks to create certain kinds of political and social conditions through his direct actions. And in all of his efforts within the church, his reinvigoration of synodality, his talk about the dangers of clericalism, his speeches where he talks about the church as a field hospital for the injured. He's trying to do these two things at one and the same time. Directly express his power of influence and indirectly influence the membership of the church so that Catholics across the world, it's not just that he's trying to do these things, but the Catholics across the world will view climate change as a social crisis for the poor, so that Catholics across the world will view migrants and refugees as their brothers and sisters, so that Catholics across the world will view social inequality as a problem. And of course, as Catholics across the world will use all of their domestic political influence to resist abortion and other reproductive issues that the Pope has strong views on, and perhaps most clearly in the case of Pope Francis, that Catholics across the world will use their own local influence to resist the normalization of same-sex marriage. I want to just say one more thing, and it's something that I closed the chapter on for Peter's project, in hopes that he won't, edit it out. But one of the things that's very important about soft power, and Joseph Nye and all the people have talked about the power of attraction, power of opinion, moral authority, it requires that, in this case, that the Pope have a certain kind of legitimacy as the authoritative leader of the Catholic Church. Now, the diplomatic role is not really dependent upon that. Pope Francis and the Holy See have diplomatic relations separate and apart from how individual Catholics feel about that. But much of the direct expression of the Pope's influence has behind it a kind of assumption that this isn't just, Pope Francis. This isn't just this guy who's saying this. It's a guy who leads a huge institution, right? So that he is kind of speaking for, in some non-democratic sense, speaking for this institution. And in the indirect sense, it's also understood that the Pope's soft power indirectly relies upon these, I keep going like they're down here, these billion Catholics are actually listening to the Pope, they're attending to the Pope, they may be obeying the Pope. And of course, all of this has been placed in real question by the papal response in recent decades to the clerical sex abuse scandal. And what this shows, and Francis has really, I think, come to a, not immediate, but he has certainly come to understand this, is that if the papacy is seen as complicit in abuse, crime, cover-up, then its sort of direct ability to speak with a moral voice and its indirect ability to influence the Catholic people in order to support that moral voice, both of those are seriously endangered. So when I think about soft power in the future, I think about popes exercising diplomatic rights. I picture popes traveling around the world, advancing the moral teachings of the church. I picture popes arguing in favor of certain ways of constructing religious relationships and political and social relationships. I picture popes trying to sermonize and homilize and teach and influence billion Catholics in order to advance these sorts of things in their lay vocations. And I think all of that requires a kind of a moral legitimacy that comes from the papacy, whether it's Francis or his successors, who clearly articulate, express, and take actions towards the amelioration of the clerical abuse that we saw across the world for so long.
Tim, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for that very rich overview, and for, in particular, helping us to understand some ways of thinking about kind of the objectives and mechanisms through which popes seek to exert influence, and how they indeed understand the nature of the diplomatic work that they're doing. We're going to transition now over to the question and answer period of our time with Tim. I want to remind everyone that you can use the Q&A function on the main Zoom control panel to open a window to type whatever question you'd like, and I can already see them coming in thick and fast, and so we'll turn to your questions in just a moment. I'd like to begin, if I may, by asking a question about how popes have navigated the tensions that inevitably arise when they choose to associate whatever soft power the papacy possesses with the strategic priorities of particular world and regional powers. Obviously, when you think back to the Cold War, there were times when there was a very sort of clear alignment between the United States and the NATO bloc and the papacy with respect to the sort of struggle against communism, at the same time as, for example, the United States was pursuing policies in Latin America, where you obviously have a huge Catholic population that supported far-right regimes that, you know, were not hesitating to use enormous violence against their own populations. And, you know, the idea that there's maybe some risk there in navigating those kinds of waters.
Yeah.
When I think of that today, I think of it in relation to the ways in which a lot of the activity in the run-up to the Fratelli Tutti encyclical was kind of staged in part in cooperation with countries like the United Arab Emirates that have tried to place a lot of emphasis on kind of messaging around the importance of tolerance and pluralism, you know, even as some of their own policies in the Middle East support anything but tolerance and pluralism. So I'm just wondering if you can kind of speak to some of those things and how I've handled them.
I can speak to them because I've thought about it a lot, actually, in a bunch of contexts, although I'm not sure this is going to be a satisfying answer kind of intellectually, but I'll speak to it for a minute. I think both domestically and globally, the Catholic Church, the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, needs to pay more attention than perhaps it often does to the French Revolution. And that is to say, the Ancien regime was not only a disaster for the French royal family, whose heads fell into the bucket in the Place de la Concorde, it was also a disaster for the church, because the organic relationship between the regime and the church meant, if you don't mind the metaphor, that when the king's head hit the bucket, the church kind of went in with them. And we see, you know, 200 years now, sort of laïcité, and I don't want to get into debate about that, but, you know, this real distance between public life in France and the Catholic Church. And so the lesson I would take from that is that the Catholic Church should always keep distance between itself and individual regimes, systems, structures, etc., because the moral authority of the church derives from its independence and its autonomy from any of those structures. again, this could lead us maybe in a direction neither of us want to go, but the local Catholic hierarchy in the US, continuing to this day, till yesterday, in talking about vaccines, the idea that the Catholic Church, the Catholic hierarchy in the US has associated it so overwhelming with abortion and other questions of social conservatism, which have linked it to certain political structures in the US, which are unlikely to endure in any kind of universal way. I'm not predicting when and how they'll go away, but the Catholic Church and its moral voice needs to be very careful not to become sort of an auxiliary of a political party or political movement or a state, because when that political party, that political movement, or that state unsurprisingly evolves, it's left the Catholic Church in a kind of a corner it doesn't want to be. So when we think about this internationally and globally, it's a very difficult, I always have great sort of sympathy for the papacy in this regard, because it's a very hard thing to pull off. Like when they went to the International Conference on the Role of Women, right? And by the way, it was fascinating. They were actually a voting member of that conference as a permanent observer of the UN. The papacy was drawn in a kind of an odd way to a sort of a traditional patriarchal position with certain countries of Islamic tradition. And I mean, we could debate the merits of the issues, but there's nothing wrong with that per se. The papacy just that they are very careful to state and behave in such ways that we are not sort of with them. This is not who we are. We have a broad-based moral agenda. We have a broad-based political agenda. We have a broad-based diplomatic agenda. And more than any other actor, you will watch us over the long run find certain kinds of short-term alliances, because when all of those other places are gone, when there's no longer a United States of America, when there's no longer a Syria, when there's no longer a European Union, the Pope believes, there'll be a Catholic Church and there'll be a Pope. And so there has to be a great deal of effort to strike that balance. And like I said, that's not a satisfying answer because I don't have advice on each individual issue. But I think if I were in the diplomatic corps of the Holy See, which of course I am not, I would be bringing up at every meeting, okay, well, we may agree with the US here. We may agree with, you know, Iraq here. We may, but let's be careful that it's always just us, because it is us that we are trying to defend in a kind of a long-term, to use an inappropriate word in this context, non-partisan moral voice in politics.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. And I can already put you on warning, Tim, that there is one question coming up that specifically does ask you to imagine yourself as advising the papacy about certain potential future things to focus on in its work.
Right.
I'm going to turn now to our Berkeley Center colleague, Jose Casanova. Jose, it's great to have you with us. Hope you're doing well. Who shared a couple of comments, and I just want to put them to you to kind of see if there's any additional reflections you like to add. So Jose says it's great to see you here at the Berkeley Center. He says, thank you for your insightful analysis. I would only add that the most important aspect of the modern papacy is the claim that they speak in the name of global humanity. All their encyclicals are directed not only at the faithful, but all people of goodwill. In fact, in the case of Pope Francis, his soft power may be more noticeable on non-Catholics than on Catholics. And I'll just kind of add a question mark. I'll infer a question mark at the end of that last statement.
Well, first of all, hello, Jose. Jose and I know each other for a long time, and I'm honored and pleased to hear that he's here today. I kind of passed over that when I talked about it. I'd have to look because I wasn't sure when I was saying it, but I'm pretty sure Pacem in Terris is where John the 23rd actually says, "and to people of goodwill." Right. So if you look at Rerum Novarum, it's actually written to bishops and primates. And over the 20th century, you get this very clear rhetorical shift where the church is speaking to people of goodwill. And that's explicit. That's explicit in almost all of the encyclicals and statements. And the Pope's reception, or the reception of papal rhetoric, is dependent upon the breadth with which he is able to communicate it. So he's trying to talk to everybody. Now, I would, in another context, I'd love to hear Jose talk about this more, because that is kind of dependent, however, it seems to me, on a kind of a Catholic legitimacy. In other words, the only reason that anyone would listen to the Pope, I mean, I suppose they could respect him as a moral voice and philosopher, but much of the Pope's status is because he is this leader of this institution. So there's a kind of intersection there. And again, I think John the 23rd is a really great example, because he's speaking to everyone, but he's speaking as a leader of a church he's trying to fundamentally reform.
Great. So we're going to move now to a question from James Guth, or James Guth. My apologies if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly. James.
I know.
Okay. Oh, okay, great. So the question is, would you characterize the likely effectiveness of the Pope's soft power? How would you characterize the likely effectiveness of the Pope's soft power on the current US administration? How is it being exercised?
Well, that's a hello to Jim Guth as well. Let me give a two-part answer to that. And the first is, Peter, I wonder if you noticed this. My whole presentation about the Pope's trip to Iraq was, if you will, about an independent variable, right? So here's what the Pope was trying to do. Here was the Pope's intention. Here's how I kind of disaggregate all of his efforts. And, I think it's a useful way of thinking about what the Pope's doing. But I would rely upon people like yourself, who are experts in transnational and global Islam, people, area specialists on Iraq, whether any of that makes much difference sort of in Iraq or in Middle Eastern politics, I'm not really sure. Like, the so what question is a very important one for those of us who talk about religion and politics, because it's difficult to get at, although Jim Guth has done a better job of this than anybody in context of American politics, of getting at what the sort of dependent variable actually is, this sort of, effect of the cause. But in the United States, I think this is a really fascinating moment for the Catholic hierarchy in the United States in two ways. They are being kind of squeezed from two directions. There is no question in my mind that Pope Francis is trying to redirect the rhetoric of the US Catholic bishops. When he spoke before a joint session of Congress, when he was in the US, he was talking about peace, he was talking about migrants, he was talking about climate change, all the things he was criticizing the US as a global power for. And then he said, and of course we have to think about the issues of life. And I thought, okay, well, there it goes. And he said, we have to stop capital punishment. And now he's saying that to a joint session of Congress, but he's saying that to the US Catholic bishops. It's like, okay, yes, we are opposed to abortion, but we have a much broader agenda. Then on the other hand, you have a Catholic president who represents not the right word. He is an exemplar of a kind of faithful, observant American Catholic who accepts the church's teaching in all sorts of ways, but he seeks to emphasize the ones that are not the reproductive marital issues that have gotten so much attention. So now in Biden's case, he actually dissents from the church's views on these, at least in his public actions. Whereas Francis is saying, no, I agree with all those things. We just shouldn't make that what the Catholic Church is about in the United States. Like, seriously, that's not the problem in the United States. The problem is its cruel policy towards migrants. The problem is its carbon footprint and its removal from the Paris Accords. The problem is that it has enormous social and economic inequality. And then, lo and behold, we elect a president who sort of kind of believes that stuff. We'll see how much he believes it. And then you have in the middle this kind of Catholic hierarchy saying, well, we get a real problem with Biden on the Hyde Amendment. And I don't want to minimize the Hyde Amendment, but I just think if the Catholic bishops think that that's where the soft power of the Catholic Church should be, while you have this global citizen calling for enormous shift in global emphases, and a president who, quotes Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day and views the American Reform Act as some kind of implementation of Catholic social teaching, I think the bishops and then you add in the scandal of the clerical sex abuse, I think the space, the soft power of the Catholic hierarchy in the United States will be squeezed.
Okay, thank you. I'm actually going to go slightly out of order because your response to the first part of that last question, Tim, I think gets at the essence of this next question, which is from Lanchu, and it's about how we should think about measuring the success of the Pope's influence. And I kind of heard you to be saying, well, that's not for me to say. It's people who are experts on the issues that things like the issues that Laudato Si or Fratelli Tutti are aimed at. People who work on those issues should really be assessing whether his diplomatic work is successful or not. But I just wanted to see if you did have any further thoughts on how we might think about the success of papal diplomatic influence.
I think in each individual case, people, I don't want to, punt on the question entirely. In each individual case, if it's targeted towards a certain global dynamic, then I think you can see some circumstances where it kind of does make a difference, right? And you can actually see it, assess it, articulate it as data. A couple of examples. When Yugoslavia was under kind of pressure to come apart, the first juridical actor, I always have to be careful to say a state, it wasn't the Vatican City, it was the Holy See. The first juridical actor to offer diplomatic relations to Slovenia and Croatia was the Holy See. And it was not lost on anyone that those were the two republics of Yugoslavian Federation that were made up largely of Catholics. And I happen to talk a lot of people in that part of the world about that, and that mattered. It mattered positively that they had this, but it also mattered negatively. Francois Mitterrand thought it was a German Vatican conspiracy against France to bring these, whatever. I think Pope Francis's effort, and it's kind of ironic that Theodore McCarrick was part of this effort, but Pope Francis's offer of his good offices to create a space, because the Vatican, the Holy See, they had diplomatic relations with Cuba and the US. It wasn't just, we'll be sort of, we'll offer our good offices. They offered their diplomatic pouches so that Castro and Obama could communicate with each other without anyone knowing it. So I think there are real instances where it happens, and we'd have to look in Iraq and see if there's a shift in interreligious relationships. And I don't think it would be immediate, and I don't think it would be particularly large, but that's a guess on my part. But if I could just say one other thing in a more general sense, popes not only do that sort of stuff, they also articulate Catholic teaching in a very broad sense. So Rerum Novarum, right, in the 19th century, about industrial relations with the coming of modern industrial capitalism, Humanae Vitae in the 1960s. Now, you could do survey data to see how those influence Catholics and non-Catholics, and of course, we'd see that Humanae Vitae was not particularly influential in some ways. But here we are, what is it, 150 years from Rerum Novarum and 60 years from Humanae Vitae. And those are absolutely elements of the international debate about the issues on which they were directed. So, and you see with Rerum Novarum, you've had these sort of updates by popes over the course of this period, where the Catholic papacy is constantly talking about the appropriate relationship between capital and labor. And it is a central choice, sort of. It's always there in the debates. Similarly, when you talk about birth control, reproductive rights, I'm not saying Humanae Vitae is influential in the world, but it is there. It is a spokesman speaking for this massive institution about how it wants to see this issue attended to. So I would go in those two ways, but looking at the individual cases where you actually do see immediate influence. And then I haven't done it, and Jim Guth will ask me that I should do this, but you could look at long-term survey data over the time to see how people respond to papal statements.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tim. That's a very helpful way of thinking about that. So here is the question that invites you to kind of role play being a papal diplomatic advisor. It comes from Daniel Canning, who says, with increasing secularism in the world and the decline of global religion, what should future popes be working on to ensure that they're able to stay in a position to exercise soft power?
Make sure that they have attended to scandals, outrages within their own institution, so that members of the Catholic Church and people outside the Catholic Church view the Pope without the lens of dishonesty and obfuscation and scandal. So I still believe that the clerical sex abuse scandal is an issue for the Pope in terms of his moral authority. So that would be my first thing. The second, I would say, as I said before, and far be it from me to tell popes this, they tend to believe this. Take the very long view, right? The very long view, and continue to tend one's own garden. Make sure that one is speaking legitimately as a voice for this institution, and then target soft power on a broad spectrum of issues of interest to the church, so that the papacy is not associated with, the Cold War, or, the Crusades, or, social conservatism in the American South, whatever it might happen to be. That the popes, I think, have to show, they have to show a certain kind of rhetorical discipline and rhetorical humility, believe it or not, so that their voice will continue to be heard as circumstances change. I do think, however, we're entering a period, and I think secularism will be counteracted by this. We're entering into a period where non-state actors of all sorts have all kinds of ways of, as I tell my students, Peter, Apple has a foreign policy, and that's kind of interesting, and that's kind of telling. So as we move into not a post-Westphalian world, but a world where there are other ways of asserting power in the world, I think this is a period where actors like the papacy have a real opportunity to be heard and to speak, but in ways that will preserve their moral authority over the long term.
Okay, great. Such fantastic questions we have coming in, and I can already see that we're not going to have time to get through all of them, but let's keep going. So next one comes from our good friend and colleague, Fabio Petito at the University of Sussex. Hi, Fabio, great to see you. So he says, my question is about the unique institutional structure of the Catholic Church. The Pope is clearly the head of the Catholic Church, but don't you think that one of the recurrent mistakes made by commentators and analysts is not to understand that the Church is not really a sort of hierarchical organization with a centralized chain of command, but also a highly decentralized structure governed by the principle of subsidiarity?
Wow. Well, yes. Hi, Fabio. I mean, I could move this along by saying yes, but let me say just something more about that. One of the ways that, because we came here to talk about the papacy today, so I didn't go into this, but one of the very important ways that the Catholic Church / the papacy participates in politics is through national and local articulations of the church, right? So it is definitely not the case that local bishops or national conferences of bishops are sort of, field offices of the Vatican. They're not. And we see this in all kinds of contexts, whether it's in Central America, or we see it in the United States with the pastoral letters on peace and the economy. One of the ways that the Holy See is involved in politics is that it sits atop this very decentralized, broad institutional structure, which is everywhere. It's one of the amazing things about the Catholic Church, is everywhere. And Fabio may have noticed that I had a sort of a parenthetical where I think John Paul II, with all of his successful articulation of soft power in so many contexts, I think his effort to draw so much institutional media attention to himself really took our eyes away from the ways in which local, not only through subsidiarity, but through the very notion of collegiality within the meaning of the global Catholic hierarchy, that I think we are still in an era where Francis is trying to, without criticizing John Paul II, is trying to recover from that through the synods and through synodality and through bringing people in and saying, I'm not going to have it. John Paul II had every answer to every question ever posed by any Catholic and any bishop everywhere in the world. And I think Francis is trying to step back from that and say, first of all, that's not a kind of a proper ecclesiological understanding of the Catholic hierarchy. And secondly, I want to bring in these national and regional voices so that they can speak for themselves and not just through me. I think it's a big thing that John Paul II went so far in that direction, and that Francis is trying to respectfully draw the Catholic Church back a little bit.
Okay, thanks. The next question actually follows beautifully from this one because it kind of also goes even more deeply into questions of Catholic structures. I was really excited when this question popped up because it reminded me, Tim, of the time that I was working in the State Department's Office of Religion and Global Affairs under the Obama administration. And as you know, it was very common during the Cold War to kind of talk about a class of American foreign affairs professionals known as Kremlinologists, right? Who would, follow every up and down of figures within the, Soviet leadership structures. I felt that at times those of us in that office at the State Department became Kuriaologists of a sort. And so this is a question from Donald Rogers, who asks, what do you think the reorganization of the Curia will have on the Pope's soft power, and then goes on to clarify that he means changes such as synodality and the seeming upgrading of the office for evangelization over the office on Catholic doctrine.
Yeah, Kremlinologists, I've thought about this comparison. Their main job was to see who was standing next to Brezhnev on Lenin's tomb, because the assumption was that who was standing there. You had a completely opaque institution of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So you had to find data wherever you could. The Catholic Church, of course, is similarly opaque in the Holy See. I mean, any of us who have studied the Holy See know that, call me on Tuesday and maybe I'll be available. It's not a very penetrable bureaucracy. But as I said before, I think Francis is trying to construct for the long term a broad-based institutional commitment to the poor and the marginalized. And so I think even the reform of the Curia in any way that he is doing it, his relationship with the Vatican Bank, for example, I think all of these things are of a piece where he's saying, I want the church, and of course he comes from a pastoral bishopric in Buenos Aires. So he's like, I want the church in each of its local iterations to be advancing this understanding of Catholicism. And therefore, I need to lower the temperature on the Roman aspect of it and raise the temperature on the local. Now, anybody who knows anything about Catholicism knows, I'm saying this for like the third time, these are difficult institutional balances to strike, right? Because the local bishops only have authority because they're in communion with Rome. So it's not like he can just say, these are autocephalous churches like in the Orthodox tradition. They're not, right? They're in communion with Rome. So he plays this role, but I think he's trying to lower the temperature, lower the voice of Rome a little bit, both in terms of the Curia and in terms of his own articulation, so that he can draw, but this is ironic, Peter, so that he can grant local iterations of the church the opportunity to do more of what he wants them to do. Right? So, he has a very clear agenda and set of preferences, but he doesn't want them to be frustrated by bureaucratic control in Rome. But he's not, he's a really interesting fellow, isn't he? Because in certain ways he's very humble, right? In the way he lives, the synodality, but he's not humble in the sense of being a person who thinks that he has the right set of preferences and understandings about the gospel and its relevance to today's world. He's pretty strongly spoken on that.
Indeed, yeah, absolutely. I'm going to try and squeeze in one last question, and my apologies to those of you whose questions we just didn't have time to get to. We will make sure that Tim, sees all of them. I hope you can give a brief answer to this one, although there's aspects of it that are potentially a little loaded. This is from Michael Walsh. Does papal soft power depend for its effectiveness on the Pope's personality, and should that be a criterion in a conclave?
Yeah, I think the personalities are important. Obviously, you see the succession of popes, right? We have Pope John Paul II creating this modern traveling papacy. Pope Benedict has a very, very different affect, a very different way of articulating himself. And then we move to Francis. But I don't think it's all personality. And we can end with this anecdote. No one ever accused Paul VI of being guilty of charisma, right? And yet he made a trip to New York in 1965 that really in one day encapsulated the modern papacy and its expression of soft power. This is, Pope Paul VI. He goes to the UN in the context of the Vietnam War and other conflicts raging in the mid-1960s, and he gives this very famous speech where he says, "No more war, war never again," right? Well, why is the Pope speaking at the UN? This is unusual. He has these sort of diplomatic relationships, and this gets an enormous amount of attention at the time and since. This is a kind of an expression of a peace church, of the Catholic Church that he's trying to emphasize. Okay, we have that direct expression of papal soft power. That night, he celebrates Mass in Yankee Stadium before 80,000 people in an environment that's a cross between an Italian soccer game and a Rolling Stones concert. The level of adulation towards him in his person and his office was so great because American Catholics, for the very first time, were being introduced to the sort of pilgrimage of being in the presence of the Pope here, rather than having to go to St. Peter's Square. So I think the personality matters, and we see papacies differ enormously in how they articulate. But I think the modern papacy is real. It offers all of them a certain way of asserting and articulating their influence. And there we have Paul VI giving this forceful speech at the UN and then soaking up the adulation of the American Catholicism in Yankee Stadium, which was a kind of an indirect expression of those people, American Catholicism, the people of the United States, their interest in, love for, and in this particular context, adulation of the Pope. Of course, soon after he issued Humanae Vitae, and much of that went clamoring out the windows of Yankee Stadium. But I think that day in 1965 captured that it's not charisma, it's the office.
Great. Well, we've reached the end of the time we have today. I want to first and foremost thank our speaker, Dr. Burns, for his fantastic presentation and for generating such a rich and wide-ranging discussion. If you are interested in this topic, please don't fret, because we have more on it coming up very soon as this Monday, in fact, Monday, March 15th at 12 p.m. Eastern Daylight. Don't forget the clocks change this weekend. Join us to hear Father Antonio Spadaro, the editor-in-chief of La Civiltà Cattolica, who actually accompanied Pope Francis to Iraq, Riccardo Cristiano, an Italian journalist and Vatican expert, and our very own Sean Casey, the director of the Berkley Center, for a conversation about the Pope's trip to Iraq and its religious and political significance. The RSVP for that event, the link that you can use to register for it, is available now in the chat box. I also wanted to make you all aware of the next webinar session in this particular series. In just under 2 weeks' time, on Wednesday, March 24th at 12:30 p.m. Eastern, We will be presenting a webinar whose format is a little different from the others in the series to date. This will be a panel event with several leading experts, Dr. Stacy Gutkowski, Dr. Annie Sarkissian, Dr. Anel Sheline, and Dr. Anne Wainscott, who will be offering different perspectives on the geopolitics of religious moderation in the Middle East and North Africa. So please mark your calendars, look for the event registration for that soon, or better yet, please sign up to receive event notifications from the Berkley Center, and hopefully you'll be able to join us for that discussion. My thanks as ever to Ruth Gopin, who coordinates all our events here at the Berkley Center, and all the rest of the center staff for making these sessions possible. And finally, let me just thank all of you for joining us today. Take care, stay healthy, and hope to see you all at another of our events soon. Take care, everyone.